The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand, who is not the shepherd, does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. The hired hand runs away, because a hired hand does not care for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. For this reason, the Father loves me, because I lay down my life in order to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it up again. I have received this command from my Father. The Gospel of the Lord.
Today's gospel, Jesus proclaims himself the Good Shepherd. Shepherd and flock is the common image in the whole Old Testament, the most common image, used to describe God's relationship with his people. Moses, Joshua, David, Solomon, the prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel, and many others were shepherds themselves. Jesus uses this same image over and over again in his teaching. In depicting Jesus as the Good Shepherd, we almost see him as this saccharine, almost Hallmark card way, with a cute, fuzzy lamb draped over his shoulders, surrounded by a flock of sheep, like the image on the front of the bulletin today. But being a shepherd was a very tough, a very dirty and dangerous way of life. The shepherd had to be strong, tenacious, and courageous. He spent his entire time with the sheep, watching over them, protecting them, bringing them back to the flock when they have gone astray. King David, as a boy, was a shepherd for his father Jesse. And David tells King Saul how when he was keeping his father's sheep, he had to battle with the lions and the bears. The prophet Isaiah speaks of shepherds in the same way, being called out to deal with lions. And in today's gospel, wolves are highlighted as the predators. For the shepherd, it was the most natural thing to risk his life defending his flock. His life was dangerous. Sometimes the shepherd had to do more than risk his life. Sometimes he had to lay it down, especially when thieves and robbers came to despoil the flock. The true shepherd never hesitated to risk, even to lay down his life for his sheep. Every night, the sheep were gathered into what is called a sheepfold. It was an enclosed area, usually on a hillside, with 3 walls on either side. And on the 4th side, there was an opening for where the sheep would come in and go out. But there was no door of any kind. At night, the shepherd himself lay down across the opening, and no sheep could get in or get out except by going over the shepherd's body. In the most literal sense, the shepherd was the door. Jesus himself says he is the door of the sheep. And St. Paul uses this image for Jesus in his letter to the Ephesians, saying Jesus, and through him alone, we have access to the Father. He is the door. Jesus came to show us what God the Father is like. He came to open the way to the Father. Jesus is the door through whom alone entrance to God the Father becomes possible for us. Jesus uses the analogy of shepherd for himself, but he doesn't just use the metaphor of a shepherd. He proclaims himself the good shepherd. Although the word good is used in most English translations, it does not capture the many nuances of the original Greek word, which could be translated as noble, beautiful, perfect, precious, even wonderful. So every time we hear that familiar phrase, good shepherd, we should also think wonderful shepherd, noble shepherd, beautiful shepherd, precious shepherd, the perfect shepherd. In calling himself the good shepherd, Jesus is highlighting the sheer attractiveness of what he is doing. When he calls, people want to come to him. The same with the shepherd, the same for Jesus. When they realize that he has died for them, that Jesus has died for them, people want to come to him even more. Referring to himself as the good shepherd, Jesus emphasizes the strange, compelling power, the attractiveness of his love for us. Using the metaphor of the good shepherd, Jesus is telling us who he is, and he's also basically laying out what his job description is from the Father. He is revealing the aspects of his attractiveness, this love that he, the good shepherd, has for us, his sheep. There are 6 real qualities he reveals in this gospel. A good shepherd is one whose first purpose is to care for his sheep. The point is not about the sheep, but about the shepherd and his relationship to us. He cares for us. He loves us as a good shepherd cares for his sheep, knows each of us by name as a shepherd knows his sheep, looks out for each of us individually. Secondly, Jesus lays down his very life for us, his sheep, on the cross, and feeds us with his very life in the Eucharist. Thirdly, Jesus does not fear the wolves and run away, as the hired shepherds do. He stays and fights the wolves, often to save the sheep. Often the wolves are represented by the Pharisees and scribes. He stays to save the sheep, to save us. His cross shows he knows what it is to suffer and die. He is with us even in that. We have a God who knows what it is to suffer and die, and we need to remember that when we are suffering ourselves or have lost a loved one, that our God knows exactly what we are going through, and he is with us in it. Fourthly, Jesus interestingly says that there are other sheep that do not belong to this particular sheepfold. He's referring to Israel, to God's chosen people, and they are his, of course. But he says there are others that are his as well. They will hear his voice and recognize it and follow him and be united with him. And therefore, in union with him, they will be in union with all the others. This is us. He's speaking about us. This is the universal mission of spreading the good news throughout the world, beyond the chosen people, the people of Israel. Fifthly, Jesus tells us how to understand his forthcoming crucifixion and death when he says, I lay down my life in order to take it up again. He says, no one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own. He continues, I have power to lay down and power to take up again. Jesus' suffering and death was not passive. He chose it. It was not something that others did to him. It was a deliberate, free act, a free choice, a proactive act, a deliberate gift from him to us. He freely, willingly, self-sacrificially chose to lay his life down for each one of us. It was his sole purpose in coming into this world. He is the only person born who came into the world deliberately to die. Since he had the power to resurrect after his death, he also, therefore, of course, had the power to escape death in the first place. But he freely chose to die, freely chose to give us the gift of his life, the gift of his body and blood for our salvation. That is how much he loves us. Jesus, the good, noble, beautiful, wonderful, perfect shepherd, wanted to give himself for his sheep. That's what love does. Love gives not just the many things the lover has or the lover can do, but love gives the very gift of himself. The essence of love is the gift of oneself to the other. This always reminds me of that beautiful line from Gaudium et Spes, Joy and Hope, that great document in the Second Vatican Council. It says, mankind truly discovers himself by making a sincere gift of himself. That's who we are. That's who God has created us to be. We are created to be gifts, to give ourselves away in self-sacrificial love. Not focused on oneself, but always focused on the other. And finally, Jesus' ultimate motive for doing this was his love and obedience to the Father. He says, this is why the Father loves me, because I lay down my life. This command I have received from my Father. Love and obedience go together for Jesus, and therefore they must go together for us. Some of us obey God without loving him. We obey him out of fear instead of love. But no one loves God without keeping his commandments. And he summarizes all his teachings and commandments saying, this is my commandment, love one another. Jesus received this commandment from his Father. The commandment to give himself to us is the same commandment that he gives to us, to give ourselves to one another, to our neighbors. We cannot love God without loving our neighbor. Pastor is the Latin word for shepherd. This gospel is often used to describe the vocation of our pastors, our priests and bishops in imitation of Jesus. You know, the archbishop carries a pastoral staff, a crozier, we call it, shaped like a shepherd's crook to indicate that he is the chief shepherd of the diocese. Our pastors must first care for those entrusted to them, freely laying down their lives for those entrusted to them in self-sacrificial service, protecting them and guarding them from evil, knowing them intimately, and doing this out of love and obedience to the Father. But not only are our priests called to be servant leaders, as followers of Christ Jesus, each one of you, each one of us is called to grow in responsibility to care for others, to become shepherds, to become servant leaders to all you encounter in your life. This is the sign of spiritual maturity. The great Catholic novelist Flannery O'Connor summarizes this truth saying, you will have found Christ when you are concerned with other people's sufferings and not your own. My own call to the priesthood came very early in my life. I was 6 years old when the notion of becoming a priest first occurred to me. As a child, it is all I wanted to be. At 10, my mother, in speaking with Archbishop Wilhelm, gestured to me one of her 6 sons and said, "This is the one that will become the priest." Interestingly, she did not live to see me as a priest, because at every juncture, as you know, I wasn't ordained till I was almost 40, at every juncture along my early life, I wanted what I wanted, and selfishly said no. When it came time for university, my mother asked, "What about the priesthood?" My older brothers were marrying and having children, and I thought that's what I wanted. I started with, as you know, with a career in the theater, acting some, but mainly doing the artwork in costume and set designing. But I obviously liked to eat, and being the starving artist did not quite cut it. I went to the default setting of being a teacher, and I taught for 10 years, a profession that I deeply loved. I had my own home, 2 careers, my teaching and designing career, and everything seemed to be going very well. But something seemed to be missing, and at 33, God made it very clear it was His turn. He had given me time to do what I wanted, and now He made it very clear in my prayer that I would never be completely fulfilled unless I was doing what He wanted. None of us will ever be completely fulfilled unless we are living out God's will for us in our lives. He made that clear to me through the comments of others, through fellow parishioners, through my fellow teachers, and I was teaching in the public school system at the time, and some priests who kept asking, "Why aren't you a priest?" Others often see us much more clearly than we see ourselves. This happened so often that I eventually spoke to my parish priest and vocations director and began seminary. And I must say, I have never looked back. God has certainly kept His side of the bargain. It hasn't always been easy, but even in the difficulty, He's been there, very close, my good shepherd. And in spite of my faults, my failings, my sins, it has been very fulfilling. God is calling some of our young men among us to be priests, or He may be calling your sons or your grandsons. If you see something in someone that you think would make them a good priest, tell them. God often speaks to us through others who see us more clearly than we see ourselves, and that was very true for me. People often think priests' lives are lonely and not enjoyable because our natural vocation for most of us is to marriage. And therefore they think because we're not married that we are lonely and our lives are not enjoyable. My experience is it is the exact opposite. After 24 years of priesthood, I know now that I couldn't be more fulfilled, doing God's will for me in my life. So we all have to discern what is God's will for each one of us in our lives and then to embrace it. Whatever our call is, to marriage, to the priesthood, diaconate, or as religious sisters or religious brothers, we are called to live in imitation of Jesus, selflessly laying down our lives for those around us in self-sacrificial imitation of that wonderful, noble, beautiful, perfect Good Shepherd who in obedience to our Father laid down His life out of self-sacrificial love for each one of us. Each of us is called to follow Him in that way, making a sincere gift of ourselves to the other, giving ourselves away so that we grow in that wonderful thing that St. John Paul II called the gift, that we receive God's grace by doing His will, and by receiving His grace we do His will more, and then more and more. That cycle continues in self-sacrificial giving. That's what the Good Shepherd calls us to today.